Nobody that I know of thinks more deeply about agribusiness than Shane Thomas. So I consider his post, 33 Mental Models for the Modern Agribusiness Leader, essential reading.
I know all these, but am I actually using them? And I just had to try to change my mindset to how do I interrogate every single idea? And taking 30 seconds to do that is incredibly valuable from what I've found.
Shane writes a popular newsletter and blog, Upstream Ag Insights. He joins us today to dive a little deeper into a handful of these mental models.
That's like saying, oh, AI is really interesting. Well, no, what's really interesting is the companies and the specific people working towards the problem that they're solving with that specific technology. And it's more about the unique combination of people that have this crazy audacity to think they can solve some big, hairy problem.
It is all about the people trying to remain competitive in an increasingly technological world. And that's where these mental models really come in handy.
If you're a retail and your whole business is around trying to be that trusted advisor, you're now competing for the trust of that farmer with way more individuals, way more tools, way more systems than you were before.
33 Mental Models for the Modern Agribusiness Leader with writer and agribusiness analyst Shane Thomas on today's Future of Agriculture podcast. Hello, fellow Ag Nerd. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the Future of Agriculture. My name is Tim Hamrich, and every week you and I get to hear from the founders, farmers, innovators, in this case, analysts and writers that are shaping the future of the ag industry. This is probably a long overdue episode to finally get Shane Thomas on the show. Shane, as a lot of you already know, writes the very popular newsletter Upstream Ag Insights. He's been providing extremely detailed news and analysis to subscribers for several years now. And I've been lucky enough to know Shane since, I think maybe even before he started the newsletter. I know we met back at a seed conference in Chicago, like maybe 2018, 2019, somewhere around there. For the past couple of years, Shane's been able to go full-time on writing his newsletter, Upstream Ag Insights, and I highly suggest you subscribe if you're not already a subscriber, and take it even a step further and become a paid subscriber to support the incredible work Shane puts out there every single week. In addition to Upstream, Shane has a background based in agronomy, ag retail, sales, marketing, strategy, and precision ag. This allows him to bring together the latest in happenings in agricultural technology and business to piece together how it impacts the industry. He's based in Calgary, Alberta, in Canada. And this episode came about really, I think, around the first of the year when I revisited his 2025 post titled 33 Mental Models for the Modern Agribusiness Leader. I think all 33 of these are important for each and every listener of this show to at least be aware of, but I didn't think bringing him on here and listing out all 33 would make for a super great podcast episode. So instead, I chose just to explore a handful of them with Shane. I think we get to maybe 6 or 7 on his list, or 6, 7 for my middle school listeners and parents of those middle school listeners. Shout out to you. But most of these ideas Shane dug up in his extensive research that he does each and every day, and he found really clear ways to apply them to an agribusiness context. Some are a combination of ideas, and a few are probably even some Shane Thomas originals, I imagine, in there as well. Anyway, here's my interview with the one and only writer of Upstream Ag Insights, Shane Thomas. Let's dive into these mental models, because I think I'm titling this episode, kind of mental models for the agribusiness leader off of your title at Upstream Ag Insights, where you wrote this really impressive piece of 33 different mental models for the modern agribusiness leader. I love sort of compilation posts like this, because obviously these 33 have popped up in your newsletter elsewhere and in posts that you've written elsewhere. But I kind of like this sort of roundup approach, and I thought this would be a great prompt for me to reach out to you to see if we can get you on the show to talk about some of them. For the listeners, we're not going to go through 33. I have 7 flagged right now. I don't even know if we'll get to 7, but I do think this is interesting. And maybe before we dive into what those 7 are, could you just provide some context on what a mental model is and kind of why you think this might be helpful for agribusiness leaders?
Yeah, so there's a couple things, but I think at the end of the day, they are basically frameworks for thinking about the world. And I think where these really started was Charlie Munger. He has a talk that's really interesting to listen to. It's called The Psychology of Human Misjudgment. And his goal was really to round up all these big ideas from major disciplines, biology, physics, those sorts of things, and say, hey, what helps me understand the reality of the world? And his logic was more for making investments. And so really applying these frameworks that can help you understand something and inform a decision based on how the world actually operates. And so it was kind of the foundation of where I got interested in it. Started reading Shane Parrish of Farnham Street. He does a bunch of different mental models. I think he has 4 books around it as well too. But when I think about agribusiness professionals, those working in marketing or executives or whatever it might be, at the end of the day, you need tools. And just like a carpenter or, a mechanic goes in and has a hammer, a drill, a nail, different bits, those sorts of things, you use them for a specific job based on what you're trying to achieve. And if we just sit here and apply the same logic to every single problem, we're probably not going to get the optimal outcomes, just like a mechanic or an electrician or whoever might not. And so as knowledge workers, I think we need to have these toolkits of frameworks that can help us understand a situation, a scenario, and help inform a decision. And I think maybe the one key thing to say is that these models are not always 100% right, but they might explain 80% of it, and then you can do the work to get the last 20 or 19% or whatever it might be and get up to speed. But fundamentally, that's what they are and why I think they're important.
Yeah. I love the expression, like, just because something isn't 100% true doesn't mean it's not useful. Like people talk about, you are the sum of the 5 people you surround yourself by. Like, okay, that may not be exactly true, but it might be helpful to get you to think about who you're hanging around with, or, things like that. And I also think, our brain is going to naturally default to shortcuts or frameworks or models, whether we want them to or not. So we should be installing these intentional, helpful mental models so that we don't default to some that may be completely broken. And I think it's cool that you did this. And I love this approach, as sort of like first principles approach to how to think about different things in agribusiness. So yeah, let's dive into a few of these. Like I said, I wrote down 7. We'll see how many we get to. But the first one is and tell me if I'm saying this wrong, but Jevons paradox. Am I saying that right, Javon?
It might be. I say Jevons. I don't know
okay.
if it's right. I say Jevons paradox, but yeah, that's a good one that gets a lot of news and commentary these days. That's for sure.
Yeah, and I think it's extremely relevant to ag. To read a line from your piece, you define it as technology increases the efficiency of which a resource is used, the overall consumption of that resource may actually increase. So you think, all right, if I'm using a resource more efficiently, then we're just using less, right? But it actually tends to increase. So explain. That's why it's a paradox, right? It doesn't seem to be intuitive. Where is that popping up? Where are you seeing that?
Yeah, I think it pops up in a bunch of different ways. The way I tend to apply it, and we hear it a lot in the AI world now, but where I think it's useful and where I started talking about it within Upstream was in the, call it precision agriculture, variable rate sort of application scenarios, where I think it's important maybe to go back to, Jevons paradox is named after William Jevons, and he was a British engineer, I believe, or economist, I think. And essentially he noticed that as you had heating units that were more efficient with coal, we still used more coal. And it was because as the process got more efficient, the price went down, you could consume more. Now all of a sudden you're heating your house more. And so I think this expanded to a bunch of different things. And there's work on highways and a number of different areas. But in agriculture, you have this efficiency side of things with variable rate fertility, for example. And I think the whole view within variable rate fertility was, well, if we understand what's going on and we can apply more precisely, we're going to use less fertilizer or less herbicide in the instance of, say, John Deere with their See and Spray technology. But really, and this has played out more in fertilizer, I would say, remains to be seen whether it's going to happen in the crop protection and spray side of things. But as you get more efficient with it, because now you better understand where to apply fertilizer like nitrogen or phosphorus based on variable rate capabilities, now you might apply more in the area that can best use that nitrogen or that phosphorus, apply less in certain areas, but the aggregate totality of fertilizer might actually be more across a field by 5 or 10%. And I know, going back to my experience as an agronomist, was that almost always was the case, where it wasn't, hey, we now know where not to use fertilizer. it was more, well, we know where not to use, but we also know where we can best use it and where we can get paid more for getting higher yield, higher quality, managing stand, whatever it might be in those areas. And so it actually ended up, we would apply more throughout a 160 acre field or whatever it is, but across a farm. And so that's really the fundamental principle. And I think it's useful for thinking through, various technologies, because there's all this positioning in the VC world or in the startup world where, we need to use less. And I don't disagree with that. But I think there's these other, to your point, paradoxes that kind of play into that. It's not always as seamless as it seems when we start to think about it at surface level.
Yeah. I mean, we're always saying kind of we need to do more with less, but ultimately, especially when you're talking about something as fundamental as a nutrient that's going to end up in a crop that's going to be harvested and sold, if you're going to do more, at some point you can't keep going to less. Like, it's going to be more. And then this paradox just seems to accelerate that. So I wonder if, one of the places in Agribusiness Leader, this might come back to bite you, is in how you position what it is you're selling. Like, if you're selling something to be more efficient, I mean, it seems like implied, oh no, you're going to be more efficient, so obviously you want to buy this, but maybe you have to think through some of those kind of, what are the second order effects of that? What's that mean for a customer, but also in aggregate, what's that mean for resource use? I don't know. Can it be applied on a micro level like that, or is it really just kind of like global resource consumption?
I mean, it can be global resource, but maybe an example, and it depends how you interpret this. But if we go back to the John Deere side of things, if you look at John Deere with See and Spray, how they originally were positioning the See and Spray capabilities, it was all about saving money, using less herbicide, and was kind of the focus. If you go back to 21, I think when it launched, 22, 23, if you go look at the messaging that they're sharing now, it's all about better, different, some resistance management, all these different things. And that's not necessarily reinforcing that there is use of more, although there is some studies that kind of show that. But to your point, I think it goes back to, if you're going to position something as, hey, this is going to save you money, hey, you're going to use less, I think you need to make sure you're doing the work to show that that is actually true. And you need to understand the incentive structure around that to really say that that is going to happen. In the instance of crop protection, or in the instance of farmers going for yield, you're incentivized to still grow more. And so using less doesn't necessarily always make sense. It might save you a little bit of money in the short term, but there might be a scenario where that farmer needs to use more. And then if you're positioning it purely as saving money, that farmer might say, well, why am I using more now? And again, these are, extreme sort of generic examples, but there is total applicability to make sure that you understand where and why you might reduce the total needs or total demands. And I think it's maybe interesting to answer your question there originally in a little different way too, of like, if someone's trying to make change based on policy or whatever, you do need to consider Jevons paradox, and you do need to think about these sorts of scenarios when making those different outcomes. And to your point, the incentives just need to be considered all the way through when looking at it, because if you don't change the incentive, Charlie Munger is kind of catalyst for all of this, and that's his big thing is show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. And so I think that ties in really nicely.
Cool. All right, Jevons paradox. I'm going to adopt your pronunciation of it. That's the first one. Let's go on to the next one. I know you talk about ag retail a lot on Upstream Ag Insights. You have a background in ag retail, and obviously it is where the rubber meets the road in a lot of ways in agribusiness. One of the other mental models that caught my eye was this idea of influence erosion. So can you talk about, in an ag retail context, what you mean by influence erosion?
Yeah, and so I think the kind of whole macro idea of this is that where a retail's margin and their ability to make a sale to a farmer comes from is being able to influence that farmer to use a specific fertilizer, use a herbicide, or whatever it is. And when you go back to 2005, I think is one of the years I referenced, but you could go back anytime before that too. When you look at the number of groups that were competing for attention and that influence at the farm gate or of that farmer, you basically had extension. You might have had occasional sales reps from some of the different companies that were out there. But fundamentally, over the last 2 decades, what we've seen is you now have a proliferation of ag tech startups. You have a proliferation of independent consultants. You have the internet. So you have social media, YouTube, where you can get answers, now LLMs. And so there's all these different tools and people and companies out there that are really trying to, I guess, influence that farmer. And if you're a retail and your whole business is around trying to be that trusted advisor on a daily basis, you're now competing for the trust of that farmer with way more individuals, way more tools, way more systems than you were before. And if that erosion declines, all of a sudden your ability to make a viable margin decreases, ability to forecast decreases, your ability to invest in the right assets decreases, because everything is really based off of having that influence. And so over the last 2 decades, my view is that that has been generally declining. Again, I still think they're the core group that influence the retail, but it's just been declining over time, which has those kind of second order effects for the retails themselves.
Yeah, this is huge. And I think a lot of us are thinking about this in the age of AI is like, okay, our business is built on some degree of influence, and don't take that the wrong way. If you're listening and think, oh, if your business is based on manipulating people, then you shouldn't be in business. And I agree with that. And I don't mean manipulation in a negative sense, like forcing them to buy something they shouldn't buy. But like, if you're a less relevant part of their life, your business is going to decline. And you make a great case for all these other things that are taking your relevance away. What can people do about that? If I'm listening, I'm like, yeah, that would be a big deal. If like my customer that I always thought I was a trusted advisor for is saying like, yeah, you're kind of getting a little bit more expendable every year.
Yeah, I mean, and it's a great comment. And I don't know if there's any one right answer, but the things I think about are, and again, I'll specifically talk in a retail sort of fashion here, is like, there's one, how do I make sure I'm investing in my staff and my team to make sure that they're more capable of influencing? And again, to your point, it's not about manipulation. It's about being able to build those relationships up, be able to have a value-added conversation. And so how do you think about investing in the knowledge infrastructure at your retail location? How do you make sure that you're investing in the right assets that are going to be able to deliver products to the farmer that they need, that they can't get anywhere else, or that you make it more simple to obtain? I think the other way is thinking about, this is, I don't know if one was on your list, but one that I talk about in the 33 mental models, but is this concept of friction reduction. How do you make yourself more easy to get into contact with? How do you make it more easy for a customer to do business with you? Because part of being trusted, part of having influence is making sure that you're seamlessly available. And that doesn't mean answering your phone necessarily at 11 p.m. at night, but it might be making sure that that farmer can pay their bill online at 6 a.m. in the morning when they need, because they have to go travel, they can't come into the office or what have you. And so I think those are little things that need to be thought of. And I think it's just part of having a strategy around what do we need to do and who do we want to be as a retail to make sure that we are going to maintain our influence and understanding of that customer base.
Yeah. No, I love this one. I think back to my merchandising days. I had a boss in grain merchandising. At that point, we were originating a lot from the farm. And he would always talk about, obviously, you can't be a transaction. Like if you're a transaction, you're a commodity. You're worth, not worth any more than transacting over any digital platform or anything else. And so he would always say, complicate the relationship. And the wording is all wrong. But that's just the way he would always put it, because he'd be like, he would learn their birthdays and he would learn their kids' names, and he would coach youth sports with them. And like, he's like, all right, well, then we have like a more dynamic relationship. So especially in ag retail, that's sort of that's what ag retail is all about, right? Being present, being part of the community, being someone that's a person and not just a transaction. But yeah, like you said, there's a lot of ways to do that, but I think it's critical. And I'm wondering how I can do that when, essentially I'm in this digital abstraction in most of the work that I do. And so how do I kind of become a person and not just a digital abstraction? But that's more of a personal consultation session I need to book with you, Shane, probably.
No, but I don't know if I would have an answer, but I think it's interesting, just as a quick aside too, is like, if you're a crop input manufacturer and you sell through the retail channel, like how do you make sure that you are, again, maybe you want to go around the retail and you want them to lose influence, but there's this other avenue where, we'll probably talk about strategy tax in a second, but if you think about how do you enable that retail team to have better relationships with their customers so that they support your product more readily? And so I think there's ways to think about that influence dynamic and ways to think about using it in a positive way or using it to help the retailer out. So.
Right. Well, yeah, let's talk about strategy tax. That's the next one I had on my list. So we've done Jevons paradox, influence erosion, and now the third one, strategy tax. You gave a great example of strategy tax before we started recording. I'm like, hey, hold on, don't say that now. But like when you went full time in Upstream Ag Insights, you said like, hey, I really want to commit to this long-term strategy. I might be eating ramen noodles for the first 6 months, but I'm going to do this. And the strategy tax in that situation is the ramen noodles, right? Is like I can't afford to buy the food I want to buy because I don't think you are living on ramen noodles, at least not anymore. But I thought that was a great example. So anyway, with that context, to explain what strategy tax is as far as a mental model.
Yeah, so a strategy tax essentially refers to the, call it, trade-offs or the internal friction that incurs as a result of pursuing some specific strategic direction. And so this can just be looked at as like you can only focus on so many things. And so if you're trying to focus on, you're juggling 8 balls, it's really hard to juggle 8 balls, but it's really easy to juggle 2 with your 2 hands, right? And so when it comes to strategic initiatives, lots of companies, lots of people try to do everything. They want to do this, they want to do that. We're just naturally optimizers too, especially in a business setting. We want to optimize for, hey, we could do that, we could do that, we could do this. But you look at all these different businesses in any industry, focus tends to win out. But when you focus, there's always this something you have to give up. And I think when you give up something, you're not going after that specific thing, you're giving up revenue, you're giving up margin. But the idea is that if your strategy is right and you're building in the right direction, the upside of going in that alternative direction is higher than the alternative of trying to do both. And so you might end up with 40% of both, but you might actually end up with 95% of the one way if you go in that direction. And so you're net ahead as a business. And I think that's really the kind of core. And it comes back to being focused and really acknowledging that, hey, there is going to be a strategy tax. Let's not worry about it. Let's just make sure we do the diligence properly that says, hey, we know we are going to be ahead if we lean into this specific strategy and direction.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like the way you put it in that post about efficiency. A lot of times we'll see inefficiencies in a business, like, well, they're missing out on an opportunity there, but like not everything is an opportunity. Like that may just be a price you pay to pursue a strategy that you think is better for you. And I don't know. I think that is worth thinking about because I think all of us have it. A lot of us are maximizers, right? Maximizing is not always the strategic direction.
No, totally. And maybe I can add a couple quick examples in to bring it to life a little more too, of like, let's go back to when Chuck Magro came in to be the CEO of Corteva. Corteva was operating with a bunch of commodity-based products. They still had a bunch of like off-patent insecticides that they were selling in about 100 and some different countries around the world. I'm oversimplifying this, but essentially he came in and said, well, let's exit these countries because we're floundering around, we're spending too much time. Let's get out of these products over here because they're low margin. We're just going to continue to have to manage that, have overhead, have all the different people managing this. And he said, let's cut that out. And so they ended up getting out of, 20 or something countries, getting out of low margin products. And those were assured sales. Those were sales that were coming in for years or decades in a lot of instances. Those were products they knew. Those might have been team members that they had for years. But the decision was, hey, you know what? If we want to increase our margins, because Corteva at that time had industry, call it lower margins than most in the big 4 or the big 5 in the industry. And if they wanted to increase that and they wanted to increase profitability and ultimately set up as a differentiated company, they need to forego that. And so that's a strategy tax where you lose out on those sales, you lose out on those dollars, and you lose out on those potential countries in the future where you might be able to launch a new product in your pipeline, but now you exited it, you can't go there. But the view is that the upside of not having all this extra stuff that we're managing, that we're trying to navigate, you're going to be ahead in the next 3 or 4 or 7 years, whatever it might be. And so I think that's a really good sort of real life example over the last 5 years that's occurred. And you can look at this in ag retail where you have people, and I think it was Margie Eckelkamp at Farm Journal asked me this one time of like, retails are doing all these different things, like what do they give up? And I think the answer depends on the retail, but it's like you might not be able to be the best at biologicals and precision ag offering and fungicides and insecticides and fertilizer. But if you say, hey, you know what, herbicides, they're making up 30% of our, and this is an extreme example, but take it for what it is to illustrate, you might say, well, you know what, they're our lowest margin. We're not going to focus on any of herbicides anymore. We're only going to focus on insecticides, fungicides, et cetera. And again, extreme example, but you can kind of extrapolate that to different areas. And so I think that's really the kind of core of it, is just making those hard decisions that none of us want to make, but ultimately I think are necessary to derive, call it best in industry outcomes if you make those hard decisions and lean into that strategy tax.
Yeah. And this one could be especially difficult, it would seem, for younger companies. Well, it's difficult in different ways. So I could see where it'd be really difficult for established companies, but also difficult where you're a new company and you're still trying to figure out who you are. And so you're just like, at least this is the trap I fell into when I started AgGrad, like just trying to do way too much for way too many people and just like not willing to pay the tax to focus on one thing and see if it can play out. So, and you see that.
Yeah. Well, and I think, you've talked with probably more founders than most people in this industry. And you look at the ag tech challenges, well, a lot of them, they have this set vision of like, hey, here's where we're going. Then you kind of start to hit a wall, you start to get challenged, and they start to look like, oh, well, let's go in here. And we had our customer ask over here. And all of a sudden you're in 14 different directions. And that ultimately burns more cash and a bunch of different things. So it's challenging, but I do think that if you can be disciplined around it, it's super valuable. And I think maybe worth saying is that this goes into product strategy too. And maybe just one example of like, and Bayer doesn't actually do this, but I'll use Bayer as an example of, they have Field View. They also sell crop input products, obviously. One of the ways they might have been like, hey, we really want to grow our Field View signups and registration and engagement. And so if you want to be a part of our grower program that gets you a rebate for using crop protection products and seed products, you need to register for Field View. And so that actually might piss off some farmers. But if your view is that, hey, if we get more people onto Field View and then we have their understanding, we have a better understanding of them, better relationship, we can grow our business with them more, call it consistently over time. We might forego a few customers in the short term, but the long term is the upside. So that's kind of the tax in more of a product specific sort of scenario.
I love the examples. And I want to get to the next mental model because it was one I've been very excited to ask you about, because so we're talking about strategy, and I think this fits in really well. So like one of your mental models is about contrarian decisions. And so how do you shape a strategy around a contrarian idea? I think that's something a lot of people would like, but talking about contrarian ideas and actually like committing to a contrarian idea are two wildly different things, right? It takes a ton of guts to go after something that's contrarian. So I'm curious where this came from for you, where you were seeing this contrarian decisions mental model either show up or not show up in agribusiness, and kind of explain kind of where it fits.
Yeah, and so maybe to explain what it is, so it's a concept. I'm sure it's from a bunch of different people. Where I learned of it was Howard Marks. He's a very well-known investor, and his whole essential view is that the upside in anything is by being contrarian and right, meaning you can say the opposite of somebody else, but if you're not right, it doesn't matter. You can do the same thing as everybody else and be right, but you don't have any upside because all of the upside gets competed away by everybody doing the same thing. And you see that in ag retail, you see that in commoditized industries, and that's kind of the core of it. And so the goal is you need to do something contrarian. And to do something contrarian, I mean, it sounds all fancy. It's just doing something different. But doing something different comes from having a unique insight about a market, a product, customer, or whatever, a problem, whatever it might be, and then acting on that accordingly. And sometimes when you're doing things that nobody else is doing, it looks crazy. I mean, I think of Airbnb, where I would never want to go stay in a random person's house, which is what I thought of it as originally. And now, obviously, multi-billion-dollar organization, just stayed in one a couple of weeks ago. Use it as much as I can, but it was crazy at the start. But they had this contrarian idea, leaned into it, worked out very, very well. And so if you bring this back to agriculture, you can use an example of, and again, you mentioned it, I come from retail. I used to work at a retail that didn't want to ever vertically integrate, didn't want to sell generics. Everything was going to come from the suppliers that were Bayer and Corteva, et cetera, and nothing wrong with that. But if you look at what Nutrien was doing at the time, so they were crop production services at that time, they had acquired Loveland products. They had leaned into the potential of biological-based products, micronutrient-based products that were applied foliarly and vertically integrated. So they made a capital decision to invest and acquire that business when nobody else was doing it. Their kind of core competency was, of course, get the product into the shed, get it to the retail, get it out to the farmer. It's a little bit different than actually formulating products and figuring out and positioning products and that sort of thing. But they said, hey, this is where we're going to derive incremental margins in the future. This is how we're going to differentiate. And this is what's going to give us leverage over our suppliers longer term. And that was, back in 2015 or something like that. And you look at how they're positioned today because of that contrarian move over a decade ago, they're positioned to have some of the better margins in the industry and some of that scale, of course, too, but they're fundamentally in a position to be better off than they would have been had they not invested in that asset a decade ago.
I love that. I think we all want a contrarian idea. We all want to get that unique insight. What do you say to somebody who says like, okay, well, how do I start to organize myself to increase the surface area, the luck surface area of getting a unique insight?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to have my own unique insights for a new business sort of thing. But I think fundamentally where this comes from is like just, you could say it's reading industry materials, that sort of thing. But I think a lot of insights tend to fundamentally come from listening to customers, looking at trends and things that are coming on. And again, that sounds very high level and vague, but I don't think that's inherently wrong. I think part of it just comes from being able to your point, kind of increase your surface area. And I think the only way to do that is to have conversations with people that maybe you don't see a ton of value in. It's always this trade-off all the time. Do I want to have a call with this person? But that's where some of the best insights can come from. And I do think that it's really required to be going around, paying attention, asking questions, doing research. And I think that's sort of the required payment of being able to develop a contrarian view, because I don't think these just come out of nowhere. Although, sometimes, of course, they could. But I think it's fundamentally from the people that, put in a bunch of different time. And I think, if you listen to a bunch of the founders and CEOs that have been on your podcast, I would imagine a lot of them came from, it was light bulb clicked when they were having a conversation with X farmer or X retailer or whoever it might be. And I think that's fundamentally the best way to go about it, is just do your best to consume as much as you can, talk to as many people as you can, and think critically about what you're actually listening to and going from there.
Yeah. Well, before we leave this one, I want to read a line from the post of yours I just thought was, I don't know. It stuck with me, which is just the best agribusinesses don't predict to the future; they build it. And it's one of those things where it's like that's like a Naval tweet. I think it's kind of like, okay, I got to think about how I can actually apply that one. But it's really interesting.
Yeah, I think that one came probably. I don't think that's unique from me. I think that's like a Peter Thiel line sort of thing, where you probably get this all the time too, Tim, where people are like, oh, what's the most interesting innovation that you're hearing about or that you're seeing? And a lot of the time it might not be the actual innovation that's like saying, oh, AI is really interesting. Well, no, what's really interesting is the companies and the specific people working towards the problem that they're solving with that specific technology. And it's more about the unique combination of people that have this crazy audacity to think they can solve some big, hairy problem and do so with technology and apply it in the right way that is positive from a UX perspective, positive from a value chain perspective, positive for the customer experience. And so I think it fundamentally just comes down to people a lot of the time. And I think that's one of the things in the industry that I hear that I hesitate to say wrong, but I think it's interesting to flip the perspective and really focus on interesting companies, not the technology itself. So I digress.
Yeah. Okay. No, I like that. I like that because I do think, and I had this conversation recently, I think we undervalue the power of a dynamic between a small group of people that are the right people in the room. And I know every CEO says like, it's all about our people and getting the right people. But the magic really can come from just 100% committed people, whether it's 2 people or 10 people or 1,000 people that are just all 100% committed, figuring it out together. Like that's where a lot of the businesses get built, no matter what the idea is or the technology. Anyway, well, I really appreciate all this, Shane. I hope I'm not exhausting you this hour, but we've got 2 left here. The next one is one-way door decisions versus two-way door decisions. So give us the simple kind of explanation of what we mean by one-way and two-way, and then I want to talk about how this applies to agribusiness.
Yeah, and so this is a Jeff Bezos concept, and essentially it's about making decisions. One-way doors are irreversible or very hard to reverse decisions. So you make it and you're kind of stuck doing that. Maybe it's a major acquisition, shutting down a product line. Those are one-way decisions, so very big. And then there's two-way doors, which are reversible. So you can go through, you do it, you get some data, figure out it's wrong. You can walk back through that door and change things. And that means that you shouldn't spend as much time on the two-way decisions because they're reversible, because you can learn. And I think when he brought this up, I believe it was in one of his shareholder letters, was about just working fast, operating quickly, and too many large companies, and I shouldn't say just large, but too many companies or people, we all overthink and overanalyze. We don't just take action on a two-way door decision, and we don't think about whether it's a two-way door decision. And so I think it's really useful to consider, because if you have a two-way door decision, you can make that quick, move on to the more important decisions, get some data, change it if you need, move forward if it works, and I think that helps get companies in a place where they're a little more agile, a little more capable, and getting some better outcomes overall.
Yeah. With this one, it seems like the trap, what you're trying to avoid is just like sitting there and agonizing then over those two-way door decisions, wasting a bunch of resources and time when you could have like run a quick experiment or a quick A/B test or something like that.
Yeah, and I think what I've learned a lot about these is I've been fortunate, probably similar to you, Tim, with what we both do, is you get to talk with a lot of really interesting thinkers and founders, and lots of these startups, like, they are just much better at identifying what are these two-way doors, just going and doing them, taking action, and having that bias for action relative to sitting and having a meeting about a meeting about a meeting about some other future decision that's going to come. And I think it's really useful for being effective.
Yep. What I love about some of these mental models, and this would be a good example of that, is like you hear it and you're like, oh yeah, but I really think you have to consciously cultivate applying them, and it takes a degree of self-reflection that, in my opinion, most people don't do, to see like, okay, am I falling victim to some of these trapdoors, right, by not applying these mental models? And you have 33 of them on this list. Obviously, it's not all the mental models in the world, but these are really good places to start. So if you're listening to this and you're like, oh, these are kind of interesting, or even if you're thinking, oh, I know all this stuff, maybe just spend a little more time reflecting on where these might apply to your life, because there's some really good ones in here.
Yeah, it's. I remember I had a bunch of these. I've been reading about these for over a decade, and one day I was like, I know all these, but am I actually using them? And I just had to try to change my mindset to, how do I interrogate every single idea? And that's kind of an extreme example, because you're trying to move fast, you're trying to do different things, but it's incredibly valuable to just say, hey, what are the different things that are out there? How could I think about this in a different way? And taking 30 seconds to do that is incredibly valuable from what I've found.
Oh, yeah. And it could be a great use for AI to some of the self-reflection of like, okay, here, Jevon's paradox here, how does this apply to my, retail business and or my biological startup? I think it's really interesting kind of back and forth once you know what you're looking for. But I think that's a great example of why stuff like this is important, because AI can be used as a tool, but you still have to know what questions to ask and have the self-awareness, self-reflection to apply it to your life. All right, last one, and I'm trying to squeeze it in here last minute. I really appreciate this, is the Innovation Adoption Framework. This is one we could dedicate a whole episode to. I believe this is your own original work, so tell me if I'm wrong here.
It's two other people's work that I combined into one. So it's other people's work recombined, I think, is the way to put it.
Well, you know what they say, like if you take from one person, it's plagiarism, but if you take from two or more, it's research. So we're going to say, so 6 concepts that shape innovation and adoption in ag. Number 1, relative advantage. Number 2, compatibility. Number 3, complexity. Number 4, trialability. Number 5, observability. And number 6, adoption chain risk. A lot here we can dive into, but give us kind of the high level, like, here's what you need to think about when it comes to adoption, not just product innovation.
Yeah, and so this really, the kind of core comes from an individual. He's a researcher out of New Zealand, I believe. His name's Jeff Kane, and he essentially did work on why do innovations in agriculture get adopted. And there's a bunch of work on this, but he really applied it to agriculture. And his sort of thesis is that it needs to have a relative advantage over what they're currently using. It needs to be compatible with how they view themselves, the skill sets that they have as a farm, the way they view the future. So compatible with that. It can't be overly complex. We've seen that with a bunch of products, of course, too. So it has to be as simple as possible. It needs to be trialable so that you can actually test it. And it needs to be observable. And we see this with intangible sort of products relative to ones that are more tangible. And then what I did here is applied adoption chain risk, which is from another strategist out of Dartmouth, I believe. Ron Adner has a couple really good books if you haven't read them. But it's essentially that if you're going to introduce a product or an innovation, you can't only think about the customer or the end user. You have to think about everybody involved in the value chain and what they have to lose, or how you can get the incentive to be positive for them to promote and talk about your technology. So if you think about somebody launching a new ag technology product, well, you have to think about not only the farmer, you have to think about the retailer, you have to think about the distributor, you have to think about that, and it has to be a positive all the way, or you're not going to get adoption. And so, really, the core thesis here is that if you're looking at launching a new product, or you're putting a new product into the market, how can you ensure that there is a relative advantage? There is the compatibility. How do you understand and make something trialable? How do you ensure that you align the adoption chain so that there's going to be a positive outcome for everybody involved? And I think that's really the kind of core of just looking at these 6 scenarios with whatever product you might have and saying, where's the gap in why our product isn't being used? And I think a lot about software with this in farm management software as to why we didn't see as much adoption as maybe we had hoped. And I think it's really useful. Again, it's not the entire answer because there's a ton of other things like feedback loops and margin and different stuff in there. But I think this starts to get you thinking critically about, hey, why or where can we improve our product to ensure that it has the best chance of being a success?
I love this one for many reasons. One of which, though, for years I've heard over and over and over again, it's like, oh, the farmer doesn't want to adopt the technology. And then the response from the other side is like, it's because the ROI is not there. And it just was always like, it always came down to like ROI, like, oh, if the ROI is there, the farmer will adopt it. And I'm like, it just feels like it's more complex than that. Like, to realize ROI, you have to go through a number of steps to actually kind of like, adopt and implement the technology. Is almost like a precursor to getting to figuring out the ROI. And this really kind of lays it out of like, all right, here are some requirements that need to be satisfied to an extent to even get to the point where you can understand whether this fits. And I really like this framework.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Like the amount of times I've heard ROI, I mean, I would beat my head against the wall listening to that. That was part of the reason for wanting to just piece this together, because again, I knew there was the work out there. It just needed to be kind of tied in a more practical way. Again, research and kind of journal articles are not the most easy to consume, but this is the type of thing that I think helps think more critically, because we all know that, hey, there's lots of these products that do actually show a positive ROI, but then when you factor in that it takes an extra 5 hours, I have to train up my hired people. And by the way, the local trusted advisor says that this product doesn't work because the incentive for them is not to promote it because they have a competing product, or the standard or status quo is actually where they're making money. And so all of a sudden, all these things contribute to whether a product gets, not only we could talk about adoption, but just even gets in the door. Sometimes these things need to be thought of. And I think that's kind of the crucial thing.
Yeah. And I think it's a whole lot easier just to say, oh, the ROI is not there, rather than say like, hey, I don't care if the ROI is there or not. I don't want to deal with this.
Yeah. I mean, you probably had the same thing. I had customers that are using fungicide on flax, for example, and different products where they were getting positive ROIs in all the trials, but it was like, hey, Shane, like, I don't want to spend more time in the sprayer. Hey, I actually don't want to spend more time dealing with broken knives because this one product with flax, don't want to get into it, but it can be a little rough on combine knives. And so they would end up having to spend time changing it and didn't use the fungicide anymore because of all these other things, even though the ROI from just a purely more bushels relative to the cost of the product was there. And so again, that's an anecdotal example, but I think the anecdote sometimes is the rule when you look at some of these different dynamics out there in the industry. So
it's great. All right. Well, I highly encourage you to subscribe to Upstream Ag Insights, to pay for it if you can. Actually, better yet, get your company to pay for it. It's certainly professional development that should be expensed through a company, and very, very much worth it. Shane, before I let you go here, we're talking relatively early still in 2026. It's February 17th today. This year, what are you most either excited about, or what are you watching closely when it comes to kind of agribusiness? What's on your mind today?
Yeah, I mean, the unfortunate part is when I started Upstream, probably like yourself with the future of agriculture, there was a lot of, hey, let's talk about the new tech and that sort of thing, where my mind has probably been disproportionately over the last, year, 18 months, and probably for the remainder of this year is what's going on with a lot of these big companies, which ties into ag technology because maybe they acquire, maybe they need to look at buying companies or partnering, whatever it is, but really looking at what's going on with the likes of Corteva and FMC. And so I spend a lot of time looking at some of the dynamics at the business level for them and how that could impact strategy, how that could impact some of the businesses out there. So that's where I spend a lot of time, where I'm probably most excited for. And then, I'd be crazy not to say I'm looking at the AI side of things, just trying to see, hey, how can it not only benefit me, but how is this going to, impact the farmer? How is this going to impact the average agribusiness professional? And how can we use it in a way that is going to be beneficial to us as professionals? And so that's where I spend a lot of time looking at today too.
I appreciate your work, Shane. I know I speak for thousands when I say that. Thank you for everything you do. Highly encourage everyone listening to go subscribe. You can do it for free, or you can pay. Either way, but get Upstream Ag Insights if you're not already doing it. It's essential reading, and I think most people who are subscribers would say the same. And thank you for taking extra time for this. This has been fun for me. And you write posts every week that could be a podcast episode. Sometimes you also, I know you do some videos from time to time as well, where you kind of turn them into episodes of their own. So go check out his YouTube channel. We'll link to that in the show notes too. But Shane, thank you for doing this interview.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tim. I've been a big fan of yours for, I don't know, I guess since almost the very start. So it's awesome to be able to be a participant, and I can't thank you enough for having me on.
Well, thank you once again to Shane Thomas for being on the show. Again, this is just a small sampling of the 33 mental models that are in that post. And that is just a small sampling of the really just robust amount of valuable information that Shane puts out there. So you got to subscribe to the newsletter and really do us all a favor and become a paid subscriber, because I really like to see content creators like Shane get financially supported as we see more and more consolidation and reduction when it comes to like ag media coverage out there. That business model's tough. So anytime we can pay a creator directly that is putting out real value into the world like Shane Thomas, I think it's really, really important. So subscribe if you're not a subscriber. Become a paid subscriber. I think he calls it Upstream Ag Insights Professional. Become a paid subscriber if you're not already. And let's keep this work going, because I think it's super valuable. Thanks again to Shane for being on the show. And last but never least, thank you for your time and your attention. I do not take it lightly. I'll be back next week with another story of ag innovation.